John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever believed in him should not perish but have everlasting life. For God did not send his Son into this world to condemn the world, but that the world should be saved through him. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Will you pray with me? Thank you, great and mighty Creator, who from the beginning created us out of love to be in relationship with us, who comes to us again and again, calling us to yourself. We thank you for this great season, even a season that requires patience from us and waiting, but a season that reminds us that you are already here, already calling us, already walking with us. We begin with your advent. Amen. This word from Isaiah this morning reminded me, as it begins, "Oh, that you would tear open the heavens and come down." And it reminded me of our son, John Daniel, who years ago, maybe not many years ago, maybe a lot, time flies, somewhere in the Advent season when we were busily telling and reconstructing the story of the birth of Jesus, John Daniel asked me, "Mom, why did Jesus come?" I remember beginning to explain the nature of salvation, and I started going deeper, and he said, no, I know why Jesus came, but why did God send Jesus when God did? Why at that time? What was happening in the world? Why was that a perfect time? And I thought, that's a great question, especially at Advent. Not just why Jesus, but why Jesus and why now? In the December issue of the National Geographic, archaeologist and journalist Kristen Romey has an article that explores what archaeology says about the presence of Jesus in history. What we know about Jesus is, as she writes, is a mixture of traditions and evidence and faith. She writes about a fellow archaeologist and a Franciscan monk. His name is Eugenio Aliata, who heads a monastery that is in Jerusalem and sits over where, according to church tradition, the spot that marks the place where Jesus was condemned to death, where he was scourged by Roman soldiers and received a crown of thorns. Father Aliata is also part of a 700-year-old mission to look after and protect ancient religious sites in the Holy Land. Romy found herself coming back to Father Aliata to ask him whether searching an ancient landscape for shards of a single life felt like a fool's errand, felt like chasing a ghost. She says, "Father Aliata always welcomes me and my questions with bemused patience. As a man of faith, he seems at peace with what archaeology can and cannot reveal about Christianity's central figure. It will be something rare, strange, to have an archaeological proof for a specific person 2,000 years ago," Father Aliata says. But you can't say Jesus doesn't have a trace in history. Scholars agree with Scottish pastor and theologian James Stewart, who suggests that there are 4 reasons why Jesus came when he did. Jesus wrote no autobiography. He left nothing in writing at all. He committed himself and his teaching simply to the hearts and memories of those who knew and loved him, and they did not fail him. The 4 little books that we call the Gospels are our primary and practically our only sources of information about the life and words that have changed the world. And we may wish the story had been told with greater fullness and detail, but we know that, short as it is enough. For those Gospels have given Jesus to every age. So why Jesus? Why then? Stewart says politically, it was a time of peace in the world, Pax Romana. It was called Roman peace, when under the rule of Caesar, the world was unified. No doubt it was ruled with an iron fist, but unlike any other time in history, the world was open through the intricate road systems, the sharing of the common language of Greek, the consistency of the rule between countries. When Christ came, it was a time when news could spread quickly and widely, even gospel news. It was also an economic time of difficulty. Though peace ruled through Roman occupation, deep down unrest bred unrest to the point of crisis. The aftermath of war, the extravagance of kings, the burden of taxation, most people were struggling for the basic things of life, for food and jobs and safety. Morally, the world was in shambles. In the letters of Paul, we read of a society that had sunk into deep, self-centered survival mode and moral hopelessness. Religiously, Stewart says, the old gods of Rome were either dead or dying. World trade connected the world, and the gods from the east were introduced. And then, of course, there was the worship of the Emperor Caesar. There were many gods vying for control. But how relevant were these gods to a broken heart, or to someone who was filled with remorse? In the time that Jesus came, there were many spiritual people, and none more so than the Jewish people, who were waiting, peering into the darkness for some word of hope in the coming of salvation. At the time of Jesus' birth, the air was tense with anticipation that things could change, that things could be different. The state of the world was ripe for God's good news, that God had not abandoned God's people, that God loved the world that God made, that God was Emmanuel, God with us. But this was not new news. Since the beginning of creation, God has walked with his people. On Wednesday mornings, Dan and I lead a chapel time with 35 children from our child care center. Children older 3s to young 5-year-olds. And they're basically able to hear simple messages. God made the world, and God made you. God loves you. God sent his son, Jesus, to teach us how to love God and how to walk with God and one another. All the Bible stories come back to this. One chapel morning, I was teaching the story of the fall of Adam and Eve. And without question, it was a difficult concept for 3 and 4-year-olds, perhaps even 50-something-year-olds. So I framed it in these terms. God had made the perfect place for his people in the garden, but they wanted more. And they made a bad choice and disobeyed God. And because of their choice, they had to leave God's good garden. But the good news is that God did not leave them. God went with them. When the story was over, the children began lining up and following one of their teachers out the chapel door. And a second teacher hung back, shepherding the straggler children towards the line. And this teacher is Jessica, and Jessica is Jewish. But no one listens to chapel time stories better than Jessica. I always wonder what she thinks about the stories I tell. And Jessica watched the children line up at the far side of the sanctuary, and she shyly turned to me and she said, "I like that story." And I said, "It's your story. It's from the Torah." "Yes," she said, "but I've never heard it quite that way." God goes with us. So why Jesus? Why now? Maybe you've never heard it that way either. Maybe there's always a new chance of hearing the story of Jesus in a new way that strikes you because of what is going on in your own life. In love, God pursues you because God never intended you to have to walk this journey of life alone. God humbles himself to become like you and walks whatever journey you're walking. That's not a new story. Why did he come? There's a song from the Cameroon that asks that question. Why did he come? He came down so we might have hope. He came down so we might have love. He came down so we might have joy. He came down so we might have peace. It's an interesting thing with that song. Why did he come is sung by the cantor or the pastor, the leader. And the congregation answers with this affirmation of faith. Why did he come? And you say, he came down so that we might have hope. It's an affirmation of faith by the congregation. Why did he come? Because God in Jesus knows who we are. Because God in Jesus knows where we are. Because God in Jesus knows what we need and knows it better than we know it ourselves. And in Jesus, God has come to show us the way. Amen.